Before the world ever heard his name in the tense vocabulary of geopolitics, before American presidents spoke it carefully at press conferences, before sanctions, summits, and secret negotiations, there was a thin, bookish boy in the holy city of Mashhad who spent long nights under a dim lamp turning the brittle pages of history. His name was Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and if you had met him in the 1940s, you would not have predicted that he would one day become one of the most consequential and controversial figures in modern Middle Eastern history. He was born in 1939 in Mashhad, Iran, into a religious but modest family. His father, a cleric of humble means, lived simply. The house was small, winters were cold, money was scarce, but books were everywhere. In that quiet home, religion was not merely ritual, it was language, philosophy, and identity. The young Ali absorbed it all. Yet to understand the boy, Americans must understand the country around him. In the mid-20th century, Iran was caught between tradition and modernity. Oil wealth was transforming the economy, but political instability haunted the nation. In 1953, when Ali was just 14, a CIA-backed coup removed Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh after he nationalized Iran's oil industry. For many Iranians, especially the religious youth who would later form the backbone of the revolution, that moment became a permanent scar, proof that foreign powers could shape Iran's destiny. The teenager in Mashhad watched, listened, and remembered. By his late teens, Ali Khamenei had committed himself fully to religious scholarship. He studied in Mashhad and later traveled to Qom, Iran's most important center of Shiite learning. There, he encountered ideas that would reshape his life: resistance to tyranny, Islamic governance, and the belief that religious authority should not remain silent in the face of injustice. One name echoed through the seminaries of Qom during those years: Ruhollah Khomeini. Khomeini was fiery, uncompromising, and unafraid to confront Iran's monarch, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The Shah was closely aligned with the United States, pursuing rapid westernization under what he called the White Revolution. Land reforms, women's suffrage, industrial expansion, these were hailed in Washington as progress, but in the seminaries they were seen by some as erosion of Islamic identity, of independence, of tradition. Young Khamenei gravitated toward Khomeini's message. It was not simply about theology, it was about power. It was about who defined Iran's future. In 1963, protests erupted across Iran: students, clerics, merchants, workers. Demonstrations turned into mass uprisings. The Shah's authority crumbled. In January 1979, he fled the country. Weeks later, Khomeini returned from exile to a nation in revolution. For Khamenei, it was the fulfillment of a long struggle. The Islamic Revolution of 1979 transformed Iran overnight. The monarchy was gone. In its place emerged the Islamic Republic, a hybrid system combining elected institutions with religious oversight. The concept at its core was vilayat-i-faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, placing ultimate authority in the hands of a supreme leader. At first, Khamenei was not the central figure. He was a revolutionary cleric among many, but he was trusted, disciplined, and deeply loyal to Khomeini. Then, violence reshaped everything. In 1981, Iran was in chaos. Political factions clashed. Bombings rocked government offices. In June of that year, Khamenei survived an assassination attempt when a bomb hidden in a tape recorder exploded during a speech. The blast severely injured his right arm, leaving it partially paralyzed for life. He survived. That survival altered his trajectory. Later that same year, after the impeachment of President Abolhassan Bani Sadr, Khamenei was elected president of Iran. He was 42 years old. To Americans watching the nightly news in the 1980s, Iran was synonymous with the hostage crisis and fiery anti-U.S. rhetoric. The U.S. Embassy in Tehran had been seized in 1979. 52 American diplomats were held hostage for 444 days. The crisis poisoned relations for decades. Khamenei was part of the revolutionary leadership during that era, but the hostage crisis predated his presidency. As president, 1981 to 1989, his primary challenge was something even more devastating: war. In September 1980, Iraq's Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, beginning the brutal Iran-Iraq War. For 8 years, the conflict consumed hundreds of thousands of lives. Cities were bombed, chemical weapons were used, young men marched to the front in waves. The United States, wary of revolutionary Iran, tilted toward Iraq during much of the war. For Iranians like Khamenei, this reinforced a worldview shaped since 1953. America was not neutral. As president, Khamenei worked closely with Khamenei and other officials to sustain the war effort. Iran faced international isolation, economic strain, and internal political tensions. Yet the war also consolidated the revolution. It created a generation defined by sacrifice and resistance. When the war finally ended in 1988 with a UN-brokered ceasefire, Iran was exhausted. Then, in June 1989, Ayatollah Khamenei died. The question of succession loomed large. Khamenei had been the towering architect of the revolution. Who could replace him? In a move that surprised many observers, the Assembly of Experts selected Ali Khamenei as the new supreme leader. He was not the most senior cleric. He did not have Khamenei's charisma, but he had revolutionary credentials, political experience, and the trust of key institutions, particularly the Revolutionary Guard. From that moment forward, his influence would extend over every major lever of power in Iran: the military, the judiciary, state broadcasting, and strategic direction. For American audiences, Khamenei became the face of Iran's defiance. The 1990s brought shifting dynamics. The Cold War ended. The United States emerged as the sole superpower. Iran, under Khamenei's leadership, sought to rebuild after war while navigating sanctions and diplomatic isolation. Presidents came and went in Tehran: Rafsanji, Khatami, Ahmadinejad, Rouhani, but the supreme leader remained. Under President Mohammad Khatami in the late 1990s, there were calls for reform and dialogue with the West. Some in Washington saw opportunity, yet internal power struggles limited how far those reforms could go. Khamenei positioned himself as guardian of the revolution's core principles, wary of cultural and political liberalization that he believed could weaken the Islamic system. Then came 2001. After the September 11th attacks, the United States invaded Afghanistan, toppling the Taliban, an enemy of Iran. For a brief moment, there were quiet tactical alignments. Iranian diplomats reportedly cooperated with U.S. officials in early Afghan talks. But hope for a broader thaw collapsed when President George W. Bush labeled Iran part of the axis of evil in 2002. From Khamenei's perspective, the label confirmed long-held suspicions about American intentions. The nuclear issue soon dominated headlines. Western governments accused Iran of seeking nuclear weapons. Iran insisted its program was peaceful. Sanctions intensified. Covert operations and cyber attacks, such as the Stuxnet virus, targeted Iranian facilities. Inside Iran, economic pressure mounted. Yet Khamenei framed resistance as survival. Self-reliance became doctrine. Negotiation was permitted, but from a position of strength. In 2015, after years of diplomacy, Iran and world powers reached the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, limiting Iran's nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. For Americans, it was a contentious deal. For Iranians, it was cautious optimism. Khamenei endorsed the agreement, but skeptically. He warned that trust in the United States should remain limited. When the U.S. withdrew from the deal in 2018 under President Donald Trump and reimposed sanctions, hardliners in Iran argued they had been vindicated. Through it all, Khamenei remained consistent in tone, distrustful of American power, protective of revolutionary identity, committed to a vision of Iran as independent and resistant. But history is rarely simple. To supporters inside Iran, he is the guardian of sovereignty, the man who steered the country through war, sanctions, assassinations, and global pressure without surrendering its system. To critics inside and outside Iran, he represents authoritarian control, suppression of dissent, and resistance to political liberalization. Mass protests have erupted at various points: 1999, the Green Movement of 2009, 2019 economic protests, and the nationwide demonstrations following the death of Mahsa Amini in 2022. Each time, the state responded firmly. Each time, debates about Iran's future intensified. Now in his 80s, Ali Khamenei stands as one of the longest-serving heads of state in the world. He has outlasted multiple U.S. presidents, regional wars, economic crises, and shifting global alliances. The thin boy from Mashhad became a central architect of modern Iran's trajectory. For Americans seeking to understand him, the story is not merely about ideology. It is about memory of coups, of war, of revolution. It is about a worldview forged in prison cells and battlefield reports. It is about a leader who believes that survival requires vigilance. History will debate him for decades to come. But the astonishing truth remains. From a modest cleric's home in Mashhad to the apex of power in Tehran, Ali Khamenei's life mirrors the upheavals of modern Iran itself, a nation still wrestling with identity, sovereignty, faith, and its complicated relationship with the United States. And the story, far from over, continues to unfold.
The night Tehran burned with revolution, Ali Khamenei did not celebrate. He watched. From a modest office lit by a single lamp, he studied the faces of young men who believed history had just ended and paradise was about to begin. He knew better. Revolutions did not end history, they detonated it. Outside, chants echoed through the streets. Death to the Shah! Independence! Islamic Republic! For millions, it felt like rebirth. But for Khamenei, the real test had only begun. The monarchy was gone. The Americans had lost their most powerful ally in the Middle East. The Soviet Union watched cautiously from the north. Iraq's Saddam Hussein calculated from the west. Israel observed from afar. Washington fumed in disbelief. And in the vacuum of fallen power, a new system was being constructed from scratch. The Islamic Republic was not simply a change of government, it was an experiment, one that fused elections with theology, ballots with clerical oversight. The concept of vilayat-e-faqih placed ultimate authority in the hands of a supreme leader. It was revolutionary, controversial, and unprecedented in the modern era. At first, Khamenei worked as a loyal lieutenant to Ruhollah Khomeini. He traveled, he spoke, he helped consolidate the fragile new order, but enemies gathered quickly. Inside Iran, leftist factions, nationalists, Islamists, and liberals fought over the revolution's soul. Outside Iran, governments feared the export of revolutionary ideology. Then came September 1980. Without warning, Iraqi forces crossed the border. Saddam Hussein believed Iran was weak, divided by revolution, purging its military, still forming institutions. He calculated that a swift invasion would seize oil-rich territory and establish Iraq as the dominant Gulf power. He was wrong. The Iran-Iraq War would become one of the longest and bloodiest conflicts of the late 20th century. For 8 relentless years, trench warfare, missile attacks, and chemical weapons scarred the region. Young Iranian volunteers marched to the front lines in human waves. Cities like Khorramshahr became symbols of resistance. Khamenei, now deeply embedded in national leadership, witnessed a transformation. The war did something paradoxical. It strengthened the very revolution Saddam had hoped to crush. War forged loyalty. It elevated the Revolutionary Guard from a fledgling force into a pillar of the state. It solidified narratives of martyrdom and sacrifice. It turned survival into ideology. For Americans watching from afar, Iran was often reduced to headlines: Islamic radicals, anti-U.S. regime, hostile rhetoric. But inside Iran, the memory of 1953 and U.S. support for Iraq during the war shaped a different story. To Khamenei, global politics was not abstract theory. It was memory layered upon memory. Then, in June 1981, an explosion changed his life forever. During a public speech, a bomb concealed inside a tape recorder detonated. The blast tore through his body, severely damaging his right arm. Blood covered the floor. For hours, it was unclear if he would survive. He did. The failed assassination attempt elevated his status. Survival became symbolic. He was no longer just a cleric. He was a wounded revolutionary. Later that year, he became president of Iran. As president, Khamenei was not the supreme authority. That remained Khamenei. But he played a central role in wartime governance. He dealt with economic collapse, international isolation, and endless battlefield casualties. In Washington, policymakers debated how to contain Iran. The hostage crisis still cast a long shadow. Trust was non-existent. Yet geopolitics is rarely simple. In the mid-1980s, a secret operation, later known as the Iran-Contra affair, revealed that elements within the U.S. government had covertly facilitated arms sales to Iran, despite public hostility. The episode exposed the complexity beneath the rhetoric. Power, Khamenei learned, was rarely what it seemed on television. When the war finally ended in 1988, Iran was exhausted. Entire generations had been shaped by sacrifice. The economy was battered. Cemeteries were full. Then, in 1989, the unthinkable happened. Khomeini died. Millions flooded the streets for his funeral. The architect of the revolution was gone. The question of succession threatened to fracture the state. In a pivotal meeting of the Assembly of Experts, Ali Khamenei's name emerged. It surprised many. He was respected, but not seen as the most senior cleric. Yet he possessed 3 decisive qualities: revolutionary legitimacy, presidential experience, and institutional trust, especially within the security establishment. He was selected as supreme leader. The transformation was staggering. The unwavering dissident now held ultimate authority over Iran's armed forces, judiciary, intelligence apparatus, and strategic direction. But leadership in the post-war era required adaptation. The 1990s brought a changing world. The Soviet Union collapsed. The United States became the sole superpower. The Gulf War reshaped regional alliances. Iran faced isolation, sanctions, and internal debates about reform. When reformist President Mohammad Khatami called for a dialogue of civilizations, many Americans saw hope. Cultural exchanges increased. Students debated openly. Newspapers flourished. Yet within Iran's complex power structure, tensions simmered. Khamenei balanced reformist enthusiasm with caution. To him, rapid Western-style liberalization risked undermining the ideological foundation of the state. He had seen what external influence could do. He remembered 1953. Then came September 11, 2001. The attacks on New York and Washington stunned the world. Iran quietly condemned the attacks. For a brief moment, strategic interests overlapped. Both Iran and the United States opposed the Taliban. Behind closed doors, diplomats communicated. But in 2002, President George W. Bush labeled Iran part of the axis of evil. The phrase landed in Tehran like a thunderclap. For Khamenei, it confirmed his suspicion that American hostility was structural, not situational. The nuclear issue soon escalated into the central standoff between Iran and Washington. Iran insisted its program was for peaceful energy and medical purposes. The United States and its allies feared weaponization. Sanctions tightened. Cyber operations targeted facilities. Scientists were assassinated. Iran's economy strained under pressure. Yet internally, resistance became a rallying cry. Self-sufficiency, strategic patience, endurance. In 2015, after years of tense negotiations, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was signed. It limited Iran's nuclear activities in exchange for sanctions relief. Khamenei permitted the deal, but warned against trusting American promises. When the U.S. withdrew from the agreement in 2018, Iranian hardliners argued that skepticism had been justified. History once again seemed cyclical. Through protests, economic turmoil, regional conflicts in Syria and Iraq, and shifting alliances with Russia and China, Khamenei maintained the same core doctrine: survival through resistance. To his supporters, he is a symbol of defiance against global pressure. To his critics, he represents entrenched authority and limited political freedom. But regardless of perspective, one fact remains undeniable. Few leaders in modern history have shaped their nation's trajectory for so long through so many global transformations. The boy from Mashhad became a central axis of Middle Eastern geopolitics. And as Washington debates policy, as Tehran debates reform, as young Iranians debate their future, the shadow of Ali Khamenei stretches across decades of revolution, war, and uneasy confrontation. History did not end the night the Shah fell. It accelerated. And the story is still unfolding.
By the early 2000s, Ali Khamenei had become more than a supreme leader. He was a symbol, a sentinel watching the world from behind the walls of Tehran. Every headline from Washington, every missile test in Israel, every whisper of sanctions in Brussels reached him as signals, not merely news. For Khamenei, the world was a chessboard and every pawn mattered. Then came the whispering shadows of covert operations. The CIA had been watching Iran closely since 1953, and decades of mistrust had accumulated into a complex web of intelligence, sabotage, and diplomacy. Cyber attacks, political assassinations, secret arms deals, these were the invisible battles Khamenei navigated silently. Inside Iran, the Revolutionary Guard had transformed into an elite disciplined force that not only defended borders, but also acted as the state's ideological anchor. Its leaders were loyal to Khamenei personally. Among them was a rising figure whose reputation would later terrify America, Qasem Soleimani. Soleimani was strategic, fearless, and relentless, and he became the architect of Iran's expanding influence across Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. Khamenei observed, guided, and occasionally restrained. In private meetings, he would listen to military briefings, reviewing maps dotted with U.S. bases, Israeli enclaves, and proxy positions across the Middle East. He understood that Iran's survival required both subtle diplomacy and hard-line deterrence. In 2009, when millions of Iranians poured into the streets protesting alleged election fraud, an uprising known as the Green Movement, Khamenei's response was swift.
He framed the protests as threats not merely to the government, but to the very revolution itself. Security forces cracked down, leaders of the movement were imprisoned. Yet the event also revealed cracks, a younger generation increasingly impatient with decades of isolation and restriction. Across the globe, American policymakers struggled to understand the complexity of Khamenei. To them, he was the embodiment of resistance, an immovable figure in Tehran defying U.S. interests. To Iranians loyal to the revolution, he was a guardian, preserving independence against overwhelming international pressure.
Tensions escalated again in 2015. After years of negotiation, Iran reached the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. For a brief moment, the world's media framed it as diplomacy triumphing over decades of enmity. Khamenei publicly endorsed the agreement, but with a caveat: trust in the United States must be limited. He was wary, remembering coups, sanctions, and covert interference. The fragile hope ended abruptly in 2018 when President Donald Trump withdrew from the JCPOA and reimposed crushing sanctions. Economies faltered, the rial collapsed, and ordinary Iranians felt the pinch. But Khamenei's doctrine remained unchanged. Survival demanded vigilance, patience, and preparation for confrontation. In these years, the battlefield expanded beyond borders. Cyber warfare became commonplace. Iranian scientists faced targeted assassinations. U.S. drones struck across Iraq and Syria. Khamenei, rarely appearing in public, orchestrated responses with precision. Every strike, every cyber intrusion, every public statement was measured to maximize strategic advantage and minimize vulnerability. Meanwhile, the Middle East was fracturing further. Civil wars erupted. ISIS rose from the chaos, threatening both U.S. interests and Iran's borders. Khamenei deployed proxy forces, coordinated with generals like Soleimani, and quietly influenced outcomes in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. For the first time in decades, Iran had achieved regional leverage it had long sought. Yet the world saw only fragments. CNN headlines spoke of missiles, sanctions, and Iranian aggression. The reality, hidden beneath layers of strategy and calculation, was far more intricate. A country still recovering from war, still isolated, still wary, yet more capable than most outsiders realized. Inside Tehran, Khamenei's influence was absolute. Presidents came and went, reformists rose and fell, but the supreme leader remained the final arbiter. His decisions dictated military action, economic policy, and the limits of political freedom. Opposition leaders understood. Defiance meant danger. Loyalty meant survival. By the late 2010s, Khamenei had become a living link to the revolution's origin, a man whose life spanned coups, wars, assassinations, protests, sanctions, and global negotiations. Every U.S. administration, Clinton, Bush, Obama, and Trump, had to consider his perspective. He had seen Washington's promises broken, experienced foreign invasions, survived assassination attempts, and built a network of influence that extended across borders. And yet, for all his power, the world still misjudged him. Analysts simplified him as a hardliner, a radical, a figure of defiance. But in private, Khamenei calculated risks meticulously, navigating the thin line between ideology and survival, principle and pragmatism, deterrence and diplomacy. The boy from Mashhad, once reading under a dim lamp, had become a master of history itself, a living witness and architect of a nation's most turbulent decades. And as U.S. intelligence agencies monitored Iran, as diplomats in Washington debated every statement, as young Iranians tweeted their frustrations, Khamenei sat quietly, knowing one truth above all. History was not a story of morality or ideology. It was a story of survival, strategy, and patience.
like and subscribe. Hit that like button and subscribe for more.